speaker. Madam Speaker. Sorry. I'd start off before beginning any rebuttal or anything like that, with painting a little picture. When I go to the ballot box and partake in our wonderful democracy, I'm doing something very important. I'm partaking in the moral foundation of our entire way of life. Morality is what underpins our democracy, what underpins our sense of equality, and not only that, but when people have the power to hurt me, don't do so, but rather give me the vote and give me the chance to help determine my own future. What that is the fundamentals of ethics and morality at play in our democracy. Ethics underpins all of this. And I'm going to go on and say how when we have a duty to each other in our own community, morality, which is the underpinning of this, knows no borders. Before I go on to that, I'm going to start with a couple of points of rebuttal. Firstly, a direct quote from the last speaker, the proposition. He said, "War is one of the most illegal actions possible." I think that's fundamentally a fallacy. In that clearly, with UN mandates, which we know exist, and you know that various laws have been made completely legal, that's simply a fallacy. That's not true in any way whatsoever. Yes?
It's not true because I never said it. I said the Iraq war was illegal as an example. I didn't say all war was illegal.
I'm pretty sure that's what you inferred, but I'll leave that for now.
On that point.
No. Second point for rebuttal. Proposition also stated that democracy is not worth fighting for abroad. Now, as I've said, I'm going to come on to that further in my more substantive points. But the question I'm going to ask is, if it's not worth fighting for abroad, why is it worth fighting for at home? Because surely the same principles, if we're not going to be inconsistent, if we're not going to be inconsistent, must work on both levels. And finally, we heard that uncertainty is an argument against going to war, the uncertainty of the outcomes. Again, I'm going to go into this in slightly more detail on the ethical front, but I would argue that as well as the uncertainty of perhaps intervening, there is also the uncertainty of failing to act, of omitting to act, and perhaps ending up with a worse result, worse consequence as a result of that. No. Let's move on to the substantive points now, and I'm going to have a look at the ethical underpinnings, as I said, of democracy, because our democracy is entirely based on this. Every aspect of it. The very fact that we have a democracy is based on respect mutually for one another, and that's what happens when we go to vote. And if that is our principle, ethics is all about consistency. If we're going to have those principles within the nation, and this is where I contradict the proposition's claim, then morality cannot recognise international boundaries. We would be being, strictly speaking, unethical if we don't regard people of different nations, different colours, different ethnic groups, any of that, if we don't regard them on the same basis as ourselves. So what I think the proposition is doing here is they are conflating deontological and teleological ethics. I'm not going to make this a philosophy lesson in any way, but very briefly, they say no. Deontological ethics, is where actions are in principle intrinsically wrong. They're always wrong. Teleological ethics is consequentialism where you look at the consequences. This is where I was speaking on the rebuttal. Now, because on the local level, when we think that we could make a situation better, when we think the consequences would be better if we intervened in something, and this happens in all government actions in the state, we do so. We feel that we have an absolute duty to do so. And what the proposition are trying to do here is have a deontological injunction against intervening, even where, and they have to admit this from what they've said, the consequences would be better if we did intervene. Yes?
Sir, taking philosophy based on utilitarianism as well, we can demonstrate that you are certain that people will die in a war, whereas you cannot be certain that there will be long-term regime change, long-term benefits to the economy. We can see a certain harm but an uncertain good, and that is why we cannot intervene even on utilitarian principles.
No, I think you're wrong. That's exactly why I brought this up in the third point of rebuttal. That you're distinguishing here between direct and indirect actions, and you're saying as long as we don't get involved, as long as we have nothing to do with it and don't get our hands dirty, whatever unpleasant things happen over there, none of our business. What I'm trying to tell you here is that if we hold those principles inside the country, we have to hold them outside the country. It's exactly the same system of ethics. Now, you're talking about uncertainty, this is where I bring it back, this is where I think we're exactly wrong, is that the uncertainty, there is uncertainty of going to war, of intervening, absolutely. But there's also uncertainty of omitting to act and letting things go on as before. Now, if we believe in our best estimates that intervening, and we can be fairly accurate with this kind of thing, that intervening will result in less hardship, less death, less poverty all around, any possible case, then we have a duty to get involved. We have an absolute ethical duty, or else we're inconsistent both outside our borders and inside our borders. So, going to move on to another substantive point, which is that sometimes there are cases where we might be tempted not to get involved on the kind of grounds that the proposition suggested. But in fact, that failure to act endangers ourselves, endangers our nation. Now, how would this work? If you had a military operation or military invasion going on in a country near you, that could destabilise the local region, and that's near you. Now, if that causes destability in the local region, that can easily impact on your own country. And so not only do you have the reasons that I've already set out, that you have to uphold the same principles abroad for that country as you do in your own, but you're actually endangering the people of your own country and your own democracy, which is again in violation of those ethical principles, by virtue of that, yes.
But sir, given that Sam talked to you all about how you added credence to the narrative that, for example, Islamic extremists put out to convert people and to incite attacks, doesn't that have a negative effect in terms of these countries?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the point. Say that again.
When you add credence to the idea that the West is interventionist and hates you, isn't that worse for democracy and worse for your country in the long run?
No, I think what you're saying there is that when we get involved and people are going to resent us for getting involved, I think, as has been outlined already by the first opposition, there are cases where people want us to be involved and they will resent us and they will find us negligent in our duties, both as a military power with the capability and as a democracy that fully upholds in our own country the belief that we should help other people, help ourselves on those principles, that we don't do so for them abroad. I think we're going to cause more resentment if they see that we have the money, we have the military power, and we have the ethical belief that we should get involved, but because of this absurd deontological principle that the proposition is suggesting, that we don't get involved. I think that will cause more resentment, and as I stated, more hatred, more poverty, more hardship, more death. So I've told you about the ethical principles that underlie our government. If we believe in those, we have to believe them, both within our borders and outside our borders. I've told you that there is the danger of avoiding intervention and thinking that we can somehow keep our hands clean, and that's not the case at all. And I've also told you that sometimes avoiding intervention will also cause problems for our own country because of neighbouring problems. And that's why I beg you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the House, Madam Speaker, to oppose this motion.